Australia is now trying to forcibly take back a superport with a 99-year lease from China, but will face a huge compensation of $3 billion US. In April of this year, Albanese made a promise to the media. No matter what the election results are, the 99-year lease agreement signed by China for Darwin Port will be forcibly terminated. If no private buyer is willing to take over, the Australian government will directly use fiscal funds to buy back the port. And it was this statement that completely angered China. 12 years ago, Darwin Port was still a dilapidated port on the verge of abandonment. Later, China's Landbridge Group invested $320 million US to reach a 99-year lease, and its legal process was recognized by Australia and the world. In the past 10 years, Landbridge Group has invested more than $1 billion Australian dollars in port upgrades and created more than 2,000 jobs locally. If Australia breaks the contract, it must pay the initial investment plus the expected returns according to the contract, and the total amount of compensation is probably more than $3 billion US. So why did Australia suddenly want to take back the operating rights of Darwin Port? How will China respond next? If you like our video content, please click to subscribe to my YouTube channel so that you can receive all our latest video content. Now, let's get into today's topic. Many people may not know that Darwin Port was once just a remote and depressed small port in northern Australia. Due to the vast land and sparse population in the northern region and the weak economic foundation, the Australian government has long lacked attention to Darwin Port. According to an official audit report in 2012, the equipment aging rate of Darwin Port at that time was as high as 68%. Many facilities were close to scrapping, and the annual throughput even fell to 2.7 million tons. It was not until 2015 that the Northern Territory government decided to lease Darwin Port to the outside world, hoping to transform it by introducing external capital. At that time, the government released bidding information to the world, attracting more than 60 investment teams to express interest. However, it is not a simple matter to revive this dilapidated port on the verge of abandonment. From port roads, shoreline structures, to storage systems and lifting equipment, all need to be rebuilt. So why was China willing to rent this abandoned port at that time? Through the map, we found that Darwin Port is located on the northwest coast of Australia's Northern Territory, facing the Timor Sea, and across the sea from Melville Island and Bathurst Island. Going northeast through Van Diemen Bay, you can enter the Arafura Sea and eventually the Pacific Ocean. This geographical location makes Darwin Port an important channel connecting the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. For China, Darwin Port is Australia's closest large port to Asia. Whether it is military supplies, energy transportation, or large ships docking, it is indispensable for its support. As the world's largest industrial country, China produces goods that flow to the world. But if China wants to further increase its foreign trade, it is not enough to rely solely on its internal ports. For this reason, China has also participated in the construction of some overseas port projects and chose to lease ports to cooperate with some countries. Finally, in 2015, after an open bidding for Darwin Port, a private enterprise from China, Landbridge Group, successfully won the bid with $320 million US and signed a 99-year lease contract with the Australian government. In the international investment community, such ultra-long-term agreements are very rare. In fact, since successfully winning the lease of Darwin Port in 2015, China's Landbridge Group has not been idle. In just 3 years, China has invested more than $18 million US to improve the road paving, storage expansion, loading and unloading equipment update, and information system transformation of Darwin Port, which has ushered in a transformation like a reborn transformation of Darwin Port. Then in 2017, Landbridge Group invested another $12 million to build a dedicated yard that can accommodate 260 refrigerated containers and build a number of core port facilities to comprehensively improve operational efficiency and cargo circulation capacity. With the gradual improvement of infrastructure, The annual throughput of Darwin Port has soared from 16 million tons in 2015 to 30 million tons in 2024, successfully becoming an important hub port connecting Australia and Asia. Although by 2024, the Darwin Port operated by Landbridge Group had a book net loss of about 120 million Australian dollar due to global economic fluctuations, this does not mean that the operation is in trouble, because the data we found showed that the port's throughput that year still increased by 8% year-on-year, exceeding 35 million tons, setting a record high. It was also in this year that Darwin Port brought up to 1.2 billion Australian dollars in taxes to Australia's Northern Territory, accounting for 17% of local fiscal revenue. In other words, regardless of whether the company is profitable or not, Darwin Port has become an important pillar of the regional economy, and its positive impact on employment, finance, and logistics systems is real. However, just when the operation of Darwin Port was booming, the Australian government wanted to forcibly take back the operating rights of Darwin Port and tried to cancel the 99-year lease contract with Chinese companies. So what is going on? In fact, ever since Chinese companies leased the port of Darwin, some people in Australia have been trying to take it back. This voice can be traced back to 2018. After Morrison, the then Prime Minister, came to power, he often cooperated with Western policies to suppress China's cooperation. In 2020, Sino-Australian relations deteriorated the most. At that time, China once suspended imports of Australian coal, and diplomatic relations between the two countries also dropped to a freezing point. Taking advantage of this tense atmosphere, the Morrison government began to review the lease of the Port of Darwin at that time, saying that it would assess whether there are national security risks and constantly spread rumors, threatening to take back the port. Subsequently, the Morrison government also asked the Ministry of Defense to reevaluate the entire 99-year lease. But in the end, this review did not cause any waves. When the 2022 election came, Albanese was elected Prime Minister of Australia. The Labour leader tried to ease tensions with China in the early days of his term, especially hoping to restore trade between China and Australia. So he stopped the review of the Port of Darwin as soon as he came to power, and the matter seemed to have come to an end. However, the turning point came soon. Although Albanese is not as openly anti-China as Morrison, in April 2025, the Albanese government suddenly officially announced that it would take back control of the Port of Darwin. The reason is still the original national security. They believe that the Port of Darwin is a strategic asset and must be in the hands of the Australian government. In fact, this is not sudden. After all, over the past year or so, the Australian government has intervened in port affairs in various ways, whether it is financial review or so-called security assessment, with only one purpose: to find a legal reason for forced recovery. Of course, Albanese publicly proposed to take back the Port of Darwin at this point in time because the federal election was scheduled for May 2025. At this time, the Labour Party has a very small gap with the opposition Liberal Party in the polls. In order to win the support of conservative voters, the Albanese government must take a tough stance on national security issues, so Darwin Port naturally becomes the best election tool in their hands. As for whether the port is operating well or not, and who has invested how much effort, these seem to no longer matter. But in my opinion, the Australian government's insistence on terminating the contracts of Hong Kong people in Darwin may also be due to Western intervention. As far as I know, Darwin Port is only 15 kilometers away from the local Marine Corps rotation base of the U.S. military. This is one of the important frontier positions of the U.S. military in the South Pacific, with a total of 6 B-1B strategic bombers deployed. These air beasts have long-range strike capabilities and are regarded by the United States as the core force for deterrence against China. In the 2024 Indo-Pacific Strategy Report, the U.S. Pentagon clearly listed Darwin Port as a key supply node for the first time and promised to provide Australia with $300 million in military facility construction funds. But the premise is that Australia must take back control of the port. I think everyone should be very clear about the logic behind this. However, Landbridge Group itself is a private enterprise with no military background and has never participated in any military construction. When a commercial agreement is politicized, the party that takes the initiative to tear up the contract is often the one who suffers. So, what kind of losses will Australia face if Darwin Port is forcibly taken back? If Australia really wants to take back Darwin Port while the legal lease agreement with China is still valid, it will still be difficult to achieve. On the one hand, if Australia chooses to unilaterally tear up the contract, it will certainly face high compensation. At present, Landbridge Group has invested more than $1 billion Australian dollars in port upgrades and renovations. If the Australian government forcibly terminates the contract, it will have to compensate China for its initial investment and future income in accordance with the terms of the contract, and the total amount may be as high as $3 billion US. More seriously, once Darwin Port is recovered, the GDP of the Northern Territory will directly shrink by about 1.2%. This area already relies on external investment and port economy. If it is not managed well in the future, there will be even more serious impacts. Of course, forcibly recovering Darwin Port is also untenable in international law. The contract signed by Landbridge Group and the Northern Territory government that year was a legally tendered contract in compliance with Australian commercial law. In order to overturn such a long-term commercial contract, the federal government can only initiate the compulsory intervention procedure unless it can produce solid evidence of substantial threat to national security. But the problem is that in the past decade, the operation of Darwin Port has never triggered any security alarms, and Landbridge Group has been cooperating with the government in various security inspections. Prior to this, Australia's National Security Review had denied this. Therefore, it is not justifiable for them to try to forcibly take back the Port of Darwin by relying on national security. From a strategic perspective, what really matters to Australia about Darwin Port is never which company operates it, but its location at the heart of the Indo-Pacific region. However, if Australia insists on politicizing commercial contracts, it may cater to the emotions of some populist voters and win a few applause in the short term. But in the long run, the price paid at that time may far exceed the significance of reclaiming the port itself. What is more worthy of vigilance is that the economic and trade exchanges between Australia and China are still close. Once the relationship deteriorates again, Australia's own export industry may be hurt. Data show that in 2024, South Australia's exports to China reached a record high of 4.43 billion Australian dollars, a year-on-year increase of 45%. In addition, China is also the largest market for Australia's major products such as wine, mutton, wheat, and iron ore. For example, Australia exported 97,500 tons of adult mutton to China last year, accounting for almost half of its total global exports. If China is forced to take countermeasures due to the Darwin Port incident, it is precisely these traditional industries that rely on the Chinese market that will be most directly affected. In my opinion, the Darwin Port issue is not essentially a question of who wins or loses, but a touchstone of whether China and Australia can maintain rational communication in a complex situation. If Australia really wants to properly resolve the dispute, it can only return to the diplomatic negotiation table and negotiate a solution that balances the interests of all parties and is acceptable to both sides based on mutual trust. So what do you think? To not miss out on our future projects and news updates, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. We will continue to provide you with more exciting and interesting content.